Welcome to the Growth Guide podcast. I'm your host, Clint Murphy. Every week, I talk to authors, subject matter experts, and millionaire mentors to share the lessons that will help you and me be better, achieve more, and become financially free. Today, I had a great conversation with Mary Firestone. She's a graduate of Princeton University and has a master's in clinical psychology. She is the author of Trusting the Dawn: How to Choose Freedom and Joy After Trauma, which is a handbook for not only healing from trauma, but awakening to even more joy and meaning through your experiences. Enjoy our conversation. Good morning, Mary. Welcome to the podcast. Where I'd love to start is for our listeners who may not know you yet, if you can share a brief bio and history, and if you're comfortable also sharing your story about what happened in your life that led to the book we're going to talk about today, which is Trusting the Dawn: How to Choose Freedom and Joy After Trauma.
Thanks for having me, Clint. And brief bio. I have a master's degree in clinical psychology, and yet by the time I had completed the program, I had moved to California from the East Coast, and I was exposed to all different kinds of healing modalities that I never knew existed before. So energy work and even like yoga was new to me. Flower essences and this whole world kind of opened up for me. So I knew that traditional therapy, like being a traditional therapist, was not going to be the right fit for me because I wanted to pull in all these different modalities. So my sister and I began a retreat business a decade ago, which I can't believe that, but where we pull in all different kinds of healers and we go to beautiful places that are like cocoons and we go deep and then we celebrate. So that was sort of my background in the healing world that led up to living in Montecito, California, and having a near-death experience in the Montecito mudslide in 2018. An incredible trauma that I can get into more, but that really led to this whole other level of healing and evolution for me that I wanted to share with other people about post-traumatic growth through writing the book.
Awesome. Thanks for that summary. And I'm sure we'll talk a bit about what happened as we work our way through the conversation. Where I wanted to start with trauma before we talk about the idea of post-growth is one of the things a lot of people focus on is trauma with a capital T, not looking at lowercase t and the traumas that are happening more regularly in people's lives and compound and then have a strong effect over a period of time. Can you share with our listeners the idea of large-scale traumas and smaller-scale traumas that are still having an impact that they may not be aware of?
Absolutely. For me, in the book, the definition of like a capital T trauma would be anytime you fear that your existence is in jeopardy, that your life is threatened for whatever reason. And this can happen even in, witnessing something tough happening to somebody else or hearing about it calls into question our mortality, basically. For me, that's like capital T. And even like on a smaller scale, like a lowercase t trauma, if we think about even we're right at the end, or I don't know where we are with the COVID pandemic, but that was kind of like a mass global lowercase t, like almost for everybody, because it does call into question on some level our ability to live, to thrive, to go about our lives and connect. So I think that one is like very prevalent right now, and it might not be directly impacting you, but there's just this like global consciousness or group consciousness that affects us on some level.
And for the listeners, if they're trying to understand, well, how am I going to spot this in my life? What are some of the ways that trauma can manifest in their life that they should be looking for to say, hey, maybe that's a sign that I am dealing with some trauma that I should get some help for?
I think that's a great question because we can't begin to address anything if we don't realize that there's something to address. So, and PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, is anytime we've been using, we might have gotten through a traumatic or a tough time using a certain behavior or mindset. So that's an adaptive behavior, and it turns into the PTSD when we're out of the traumatic situation, but we're still exhibiting that behavior or mindset. That's when it becomes maladaptive. So ways that it might show up: anxiety. I think of anxiety as like the other side of depression, another expression of it. So anxiety, trouble sleeping, digestive issues, I guess hypervigilance, which is kind of a close sibling to anxiety, but everything's a threat and you're kind of on like constant alert. Your heart starts racing, sweaty palms, like, that feeling of like you have to, it's the fight or flight response. So if that's kind of happening out of the blue, then that would be, but I think more it's that anxiety, depression, usually an indication that there's something else to look at there.
And so, what we'll be doing for most of the conversation is talking through all the different healing modalities you've taken part in. And many of them are new to me. So, I'm looking forward to learning and having that conversation. And before we get there, one of the things you talk about that I think is powerful and is really what we're trying to do is this idea that we often always focus on the negative side of trauma. There's always two sides to the coin, and that is without recognizing some of the positive aspects like resilience that comes out of a contribution of trauma when we come out the other side of it. Can you talk about some of the post-trauma growth and what we're looking to achieve other than just the negatives that we focus on?
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I wrote this whole book because, yes, I was having symptoms of PTSD after, I lost my house. I lost all my worldly possessions. I had thought my husband and child had been killed in this mudslide. So it was like a extreme traumatic event. I did have nightmares. I did have like some of the symptoms of PTSD. And at the same time, I was experiencing all these wonderful connections with other people and with like a greater, I don't know how to describe it, but like almost like a connection to something bigger than me, the divine or whatever you want to call it, whatever you believe in, that I hadn't had access to prior to the trauma. So all of this growth was happening in these really great things. And I was getting so frustrated by having psychiatrists tell me, oh, you're screwed, like PTSD, you're going to haunt you for the rest of your life. But people in passing, psychologists, psychiatrists, like a lot of books written by trauma experts that are excellent learning resources. And yet they were very triggering for me. So that's why I really wanted to share with others that when we're going through a hard time and when we're in the aftermath, like hold on. And there is light. Dawn always comes. Keep going. We're getting through the hard stuff. We have to look at the hard stuff and heal the hard stuff and continue to heal it. But on the other side of that, as you mentioned, there's greater resilience. There have been a lot of studies done around resilience in stressed, traumatized people, animals, that then they come out and they're far more resilient. So resilience is one, a greater connection to others, to themselves, to like the fragility and the beauty of life. I think so often we're just going through all the motions and, we've got to get the kids to school and get to work on time and go out for date night. And it's almost this checklist that we forget why we're doing all these things and we lose the connection. So I think when our mortality is threatened or things get really hard and contracted, through the healing of it, we're able to really like be here and be present and connect.
It's a good point. When we read all these posts and articles on productivity and when we look at life, we can often be living, let's call it a checklist life. Tick the boxes. I got X done today. I got Y done today. Moving forward. But then the question is, you stop to breathe, to take in the sunshine, to smell the flowers, to just be present with your family, your loved ones. And that can often be missing. And it can take a wake up call to tell us, let's zone in on that. And so I'd love to start on the healing modalities as you talk about the power of language. I'll share a quote and then we can dive into it together, which is we use language all day long, every day, whether we think it, write it, or speak it. The power of our words isn't often considered. In ancient Celtic and other Anglo-Saxon cultures, the spoken and written word were considered magical in the sense of weaving a spell. This belief is the origin of the word spelling. Subtle shifts in our language are available to us all in each and every moment, particularly around the traumatic event and ourselves. Begin to notice the story you were telling yourself. How are you speaking to yourself? So can you share some of the ways that we can improve how we talk to ourselves, whether that's through our thinking, writing, or our speaking?
Yeah. So, I mean, all day long, every minute, right? We have this internal dialogue going in our brains. And, something that we spoke about a few moments ago is I think, the first step is becoming aware and conscious of our thoughts, of are you speaking yourself kindly? Often our internal dialogue is so harsh with ourselves. Like we would never speak to anyone else like that. So I think that the first step is becoming aware of, your internal thoughts. And again, when we notice that we've been unkind to ourselves, we're in a loop, don't beat ourselves up. Just like, oh, I did it again. Okay, oh, there's that again. So the first step is just becoming aware. And then the second part would be to replace an unhelpful, contracting thought or belief with something more empowering. That can go if we have most of us have different stories that we tell ourselves and that we tell the world. So becoming aware of, just for me, an example with the mudslide, it was for a while, like I almost died in the mudslide. Everybody I love almost died in the mudslide. My whole life got destroyed and blown up. And that was when I was in the super contracted trauma state. A therapist helped me reframe, rewrite that story as I survived the mudslide. I used my voice. I woke up my family. My family is safe. I was divinely protected. But just like subtle shifts in moving ourselves from the role of like hapless, helpless victim to survivor already begins to you can feel it in your body almost. It's like I tell one version, I'm like, oh, I tell the other version and you can kind of feel an expansion.
And when you first start doing that, if I look at, for example, Stoics had an idea, concept, thought auditing. And so before they would accept a thought, they would question it, say, do I give assent or permission for this to stay in my mind, or do I challenge it? And with cognitive behavioral therapy, they have that concept of thought auditing where you write down the thought, write down some alternative thoughts. And so when you first start this reframing exercise or you're becoming aware and challenging these ideas, do you start with the written word to capture it and train yourself to say, bad thought or thought I don't want, reframe to thought I want, and just train yourself by journaling or writing it down? Or for you, was that more just conceptually, mentally doing it?
I think, I love the idea of writing it down. I am a visual person and a writer. I like the tactile experience of writing and then seeing the written word. So yeah, that's a great way to do it. I journal actually every morning. And again, I think what we're looking for, yes, it is the words, but it's the words and how the feeling you get in your body. So again, I think through the language, we're all of it is like we're integrating and we're working to become more aware of ourselves and our bodies and our thoughts. So I think that's a great way to do it. Like, okay, if I write this statement, do I still feel heavy or did it make me feel hopeful? So I love that.
And one of the ideas that I saw you talk about was this idea of the person. So first person versus third person. And it's interesting. It's the third book and third conversation I've had in the last 2 weeks where I've heard this, and I'd never heard this idea of replacing I with your name. And one of the people called it from me to she. And it was, so instead of saying, I would say, Clint is going to be okay. Can you talk a bit about that? Because I find this one absolutely fascinating for our listeners to understand.
Yeah, there's a gentleman, Dr. Srini Pillai, who's done a lot of research and writing around on this topic. And I found some of his work, and I love that in the brain, when we use the third person, it bypasses a certain part of the brain that we get all caught and muddled in doubt and fear. It somehow bypasses that part of the brain. So the message, like, instead of, I'm going to rock this podcast interview, it's like, Mary is going to rock this podcast interview. And I even actually just felt that, like, like the difference in the shift. I mean, the brain is a wondrous, complicated thing that, we're still learning so much about. And I think finding different ways, that's in some of the modalities that we'll get to, but I had always been a very intellectual thought, like talk my way, write my way through things, and been always very afraid of trying drugs or anything like that. Never, always goody two shoes. And then like therapies like ketamine therapy, which shut off, again, like what Dr. Pillai is talking about, bypassing this part of the brain that keeps us stuck in loops. That's the same thing with ketamine therapy or holotropic breath work, but kind of quieting the parts of the brain that can keep us stuck and getting to that next layer of, subconscious, unconscious, where a lot of these traumas, they still exist on some level.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation on some of those modalities because they're ones I've heard about, but I've never tried either. And the idea of understanding what they're like and then potentially figuring out, okay, which ones do I want to incorporate into my healing efforts is powerful, and I'm looking forward to that. And to the concepts that you talk about that will probably come up throughout the conversations are the idea of integration and initiation. Can you share what each of those are? And that way, as we go through, people will understand, well, how am I going to integrate this or initiate this into my healing practices? Thanks for listening. If you enjoy what you're hearing so far and want me to be able to get your favorite guests on this show, please do me a quick favor. Subscribe to the show and leave me a rating. The 30 seconds of your time will mean a ton to me.
Throughout, I interviewed so many different people and worked with so many different people on this book, and across all modalities, and from, like the intellectual professory trauma experts to shaman to everybody in between. This idea of integration of the trauma is key. In fact, Dr. Pat Ogden, who's one of the leading trauma experts maybe in the world, she said that's the goal of all trauma therapy is integration. And what that means is, for me, is that we're not trying to get the trauma out or remove it, or cut it out or get it out of our subconscious. The goal is to have it just be part of our story, not the story. So to kind of desensitize or take away the triggers, get us out of that fight or flight. When we think about the mudslide, it becomes a part of my story. It doesn't become the thing that changed. I mean, it did change everything, but when I think about it, my heart doesn't go racing again. My palms don't get sweaty. It's just part of my overall story. So that is the goal of healing and trauma therapy, is that integration. Initiation, that too was something that a Jungian psychologist was like, oh, you've been initiated. The shaman in the Arizona desert, oh, you've been initiated. So I was like, initiated to what? And the greatest or the easiest explanation that I came up with was, in some traditions of shamanism, they believe when you face your death, you become initiated to another dimension almost. It's like the veil has been pulled back a bit through that experience, that we understand that we're not just these three-dimensional beings, but there's so much more happening. So that is kind of what I took it. You're initiated to the recognition that the physical plane is only one plane and there's a lot more going on.
Okay. And then before we go to our first modality, you talked about the idea that for the listeners, before they start any of these modalities, there's some things that they should have in mind about the before, during, and after the healing work that they should keep in mind. What are some of those things they should think about before they try anything, and then to seek to understand, well, how did this work for me?
Well, we're all unique beings. And even if we experience the same trauma, the way that we process it or it affects us is going to be different for each person. So I think that is like such an individual question. Like, where are you? Literally, like, are there safe people that you can talk to about it? What is the environment like? How can we find you a safe person to begin working with? And again, I think everyone's approach is different, which is why I'm offering one-on-one sessions now, because it depends on the trauma, it depends on your environment, it depends on, have you ever done any healing work before? Or do we want to start, like for me, my path was starting up here, intellectually talking about it and talk therapy and beginning to understand it up here. So it was kind of like a top down approach or under approach. But for somebody else who might be extremely physical, it might behoove them to begin with like movement therapy and then work their way into like a talk situation. Or, one of the women I interviewed in the book, Gianna, her boyfriend was killed in a car wreck when she was in the passenger seat, and she was totally fine, and he was killed right next to her. For her, she said after, I couldn't even talk about, like, that was so re-triggering and traumatizing, and there weren't even words yet to talk about it. So she turned very much to yoga and massage and, being able to receive healing benefits without having to talk or mentally process. So it's different for everybody. And that's why, in the book, I try to give as much guidance as I can for each modality about what kind of trauma or where you are in your journey it might be appropriate for, who it might not be a right fit for, in different ways to access the modality and find people to work with.
And so you mentioned movement therapy. Let's start with that one. And it's an interesting one because as we're talking, I can see the sunshine in your background, and I look out my window, I've got snow, and my son is playing with our dog in the snow. In last month with her, I noticed we were walking, and a lot of dogs, it seems, during COVID may not have been socialized. And as we would walk by these dogs, we were out for about 90 minutes in the city. A lot of the dogs were sort of lunging and snapping at her, and which is a bit traumatic. And every time we would get a few feet away, and I'd learned to kind of say certain things to her and do some own shaking myself, and she kind of looks at me, and then she just shakes it off. And then her tail goes from the scared down to, okay, my tail's back up, and I'm a happy girl, let's keep our walk going. And so one interesting thing about animals is they just shake the trauma right out of their body. So what does that look like for humans, and what are some of the different movement therapies that we can do to try to physically release that trauma from our body?
You're absolutely right that shaking is like a, biological natural, healthy response. And the animal world, Peter Levine, who's another trauma expert, he wrote a whole book about it. Like, what's it called? Waking the Tiger.
Waking the Tiger. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So dogs, a deer that escapes of being eaten by a tiger, they shake. The little ducks in the park, after they get into a fight, they go around and they shake. And we, as human beings, are taught and socialized to we almost do that, right? Instead of
Yeah, we just squeeze it into our bones.
if we just hold it in and become rigid, it'll go away. No. So, yeah, the psoas has been called in some traditions the muscle of the soul. And another trauma doctor, Dr. David Berceli, he came up with a whole bunch of shaking, it's called shaking therapy, trauma releasing exercises that literally you're just gently shaking and it releases that psoas and begins to release the unhelpful chemicals that come along, like cortisol and adrenaline, that spike when we experience a traumatic or fearful event. So the David Berceli shaking therapy is great. Dance is great. I list a whole bunch of different online dance programs. And literally, even if I'm I literally will just stand up and kind of shake, and it feels so much better. And what if we watch our children too, right? They do it before they become self-conscious. But younger children, we watch them do it too. They move their bodies or they run around and they discharge that, the cortisol, adrenaline, anything like that. So that is just, I do that every single day.
And you talk about it a bit more when you get to Chinese medicine, but also the idea of incorporating into the movement the Qigong practices. How can those help us with, is that a similar way? We're just moving our way through the trauma. And there's also a fair amount of tapping while we're doing the Qigong, right? Can you talk a little bit about that one? Because I've found the little bit of it that I've done so powerful and relaxing you in a short period of time.
Qigong was new to me when I began my healing journey for the book. I was familiar with and been going to acupuncture and taking herbs for a long time. But yeah, Qigong is a branch of Chinese medicine, one of the 5 branches. And it's sort of, to me, it feels like a moving meditation. And yet it's increasing good energy in the body, in the physical body, and helping to discharge unhelpful energy. And I remember the first time I did it, there's a gentleman in the book, I interviewed Paul Frazier, and he had, some sequences on Facebook. And during COVID, I was like, oh, my neck and my upper back are killing me. Okay. And it was literally 5 minutes of just movements like that. And my neck felt better immediately. So I was like, okay, maybe I need to research this more. And now I practice Qigong every day. And yeah, and he teaches a form of it. I guess there's thousands of forms, but he's been doing this for 30 years and studied with a lot of different teachers. And the kind that I practice now is what he teaches. And it's 12 minutes. And my immunity has gotten so much better. My anxiety has gotten so much better. I noticed too, if you're in a tough, you've gotten in a disagreement with someone, or you've been in a holiday party with a lot of energy and a lot of personalities, that just doing a little Qigong afterwards helps just move it on out.
And so for that 12 minutes, is it the same practice? It's a 12-minute routine, and you do the same routine every day for 12 minutes?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, that's perfect. The right amount of time that you get some benefit, but you're not, where do I fit this in? It's going to take me an hour to do. 12 minutes is something we can really squeeze into our day and benefit from. And his name, if you can share that one more time, I'll get that in the show notes for people.
Yeah, his name is Paul Frazier, and I can share his website and stuff like that.
Perfect. We'll get him in the show notes. That sounds like a fabulous thing that people have to try out. And so one of the ones that you talk about that I've never really had much experience in is aromatherapy, essential oils, and flower essences. So for people like me who are new to this, what should we know and how can we start integrating these into our practice?
Aromatherapy, well, there are two different things. So I'm going to start with aromatherapy. Aromatherapy, it uses our sense of smell, and essential oils are a really easy way to start. They're, affordable. They're sold at a lot of health food stores. You can get them online, and they have extremely powerful qualities. So I've actually been working with essential oils for years. My sister and I have even developed two essential oil-based perfumes that we designed to make you feel a certain way, not just smell good. So great ones for if we're a little bit in a trauma loop or having a hard time. Sandalwood is very grounding. So just inhaling it, or even you can dilute it and put a little bit on your skin. Sandalwood is very grounding. Rose geranium calms fears. Juniper is detoxifying. Let's see what else. Like honeysuckle can make us hopeful. Same thing with any of the citrus, like a kumquat, orange, lemon. Magnolia is really great for healing trauma. And there's a gentleman named Edward Bach who, like 100 years ago, was studying all the different essential oils and flower essences too, which flower essences, we can take those internally, or we can also put them on our bodies. And I asked this amazing woman, Katie Hess, who's got a really cool company named Lotus Wei, WEI, about, well, I don't understand. Like, why does it, how can like this flower spritzing it make me feel better or have an impact? And she's like, if you think about it as like Wi-Fi, like every being has its own energetic signature, that's just physics. And we don't question like that you and I are talking, we're hearing each other, we're seeing each other based on waves that we cannot see, but we don't take that, right? We don't question that. It's like you pick up the phone and you call someone, you don't think about the sound waves or whatever has to happen so that you can hear each other. So if we think about like in flower essences, like the aspen tree and the pine tree have very healing, calming properties also to humans. So it's just like kind of, they distill the essence of the tree or the flower in water. And then the essence, that like energetic signature, you take it into your body. Our bodies are 80% water. And it kind of harmonizes our body with the essence of the plant or the flower.
And when on the aromatherapy one, if I look at like, if I have one of the diffusers that is that aroma, am I engaging in aroma?
That's also the brain. So that hits like the olfactory part of the brain that also bypasses certain of these, like the fear and the doubt parts of the brain. That aromatherapy can go right into different parts of the brain. And even there was one study that I reference in the book, people that don't even have a sense of smell still benefit from the property of which is so cool, I think.
Yeah, and it makes me realize I do more I have like my little bag or container of different scents. And I'm like, oh, I like that scent versus, okay, what is the purpose of each scent and what am I trying to accomplish in the session? So I should think of that because the one spot I do absolutely feel like it makes a big difference is, for example, if you go for a steam and you go scentless versus you have a steam with a eucalyptus or another smell, a mint, something that you come out so much more. The benefit that I feel like I receive is so much higher in the scented session than the non-scented session. Like there's just an energy and a vitality to it.
Absolutely. And why would we question unless we, dive into this work? But all the benefits beyond just like smelling good. It's like, well, these roots and flowers and plants, they have different energy and frequencies that are helping us.
Yeah, I love that. And so now I know before when I get home from the cold trips that we're doing today for our kids' activities, I'm going to have a steam with some eucalyptus. That will definitely recharge me. And so the next one you talk about as well is one I've done it for sports injuries and for physiotherapy, and it's fabulous from those respects, but I haven't done it for healing trauma. And that's the idea of acupuncture. And one of the things you talk about there is it helps us go from the sympathetic state back to the calm parasympathetic state, which is where we're trying to get to. So that makes this a triple header question. What is the sympathetic? What is the parasympathetic? And how does acupuncture work to take us from one to the other?
So the parasympathetic is like, our rest and digest and like the things that were processes in our body that we're not even aware of, that just are, what's the word? Like your heart beats, you don't tell it to beat. You digest your food, you don't tell your food to digest. So it's the rest and relaxation. And the sympathetic state is when we can get, into that fight or flight triggered. The heart rate speeds up, the palms sweat, the digestion kind of shuts down. That's when like the tiger is like, rawr, and we're like, gotta flee or fight. And PTSD is when we get stuck in that hyper vigilant state. So acupuncture, to answer that question, which I love learning about acupuncture. I've been benefiting from it for a really long time, but I hadn't until the book like really delved into what exactly was happening. So if we think about like the body and different meridians, and they talk about in Chinese medicine that we have these kind of like highways running all through our body energetically. And sometimes we have like a little traffic jam or a blockade on one of the highways. And acupuncture now through the use of needles, but originally they used like bits of jade or bone to kind of open up the collapsed highway, if you will. So it like kind of opens and allows the energy to begin to flow again, how it's naturally meant to flow, which I love that. So there's so many different variations and styles, and one that I think Minka, who I interviewed for the book, she used one on my back that just like is a great one to use for trauma. What's it called? The 7. Thank you. And also Watsu points, I think, to really shift me out of that, like the sympathetic hypervigilant state back into the rest and digest. I'm safe now. I can rest. I don't, the tiger's gone. So finding a great acupuncturist, I think it's so beneficial, like not just for trauma, for everything.
Yeah. When you say that we get stuck in that fight, flight, or freeze position, and we're constantly in that heightened sense, that can often lead us to a path of exhaustion and depression, because we never get that chance to, as you say, just breathe and relax, because we're always, something's coming, it's going to happen again, I've got to be ready for it. And so this lets us just let that go, be calm again.
Yeah, it's a great tool for mental, emotional, and physical health. And to your point, I think, when we don't address being stuck in that hypervigilant state, not only does it lead to exhaustion, but it leads to, disease and illness in the physical body. So really important to get in there and to do the healing work. And acupuncture is one way. Meditation is another way to quiet the nervous system. And, it's free. There's so many apps or programs or teachers. I reference a couple in the book, but so many different styles to try. Like Joe Dispenza is one who I love. Tara Brach is another. Mark Nepo is a great spiritual teacher. So kind of finding your Deepak Chopra, finding maybe a meditation guide, that's another great way to calm the nervous system too.
And what does your meditation practice look like for you, Mary?
I learned Vedic meditation, which it became famous for. Beatles did it, and David, what's his name? David Lynch, the filmmaker. And that's 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the afternoon and evening. I learned that maybe in my 20s. And I remember like going to like the free talk with this amazing guy, Christian Bavacqua. He's still teaching green tree meditation and being like, there is no way. I am so like type A, busy. I can't sit still. That's not going to happen. And my boyfriend at the time and my sister were like, no, we should sign up. I'm like, what? Okay. So I guess I got a little peer pressured into it, but it really changed my life, really quieted things. There was so much more flow. My relationships were more harmonious. My physical body was happier and more harmonious and healthier. So I still will practice Vedic meditation sometimes. I've gotten into Joe Dispenza, who is wonderful. He's written a bunch of books, and I've worked with him on retreats, and he's a great teacher, totally different style. So I kind of dabble, it's like I go through phases.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something I'm studying more and more and incorporating into my life more and more. So it's always interesting to learn what other people are doing and see what the options are out there. The next one you talked about, most of our listeners may not have heard about, and it's the idea of EMDR. Can you share with us what that looks like and how did that work for you?
EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy, which is a total mouthful, which is probably why everyone just calls it EMDR. It was discovered by a psychologist named Dr. Francine Shapiro, who, walking through a park one day, thinking about a traumatic event in her own life, noticed that like by moving her eyes back and forth and thinking about the traumatic event, that the triggers became less and less and less. So she began studying it, and now it's bilateral stimulation. So the two different hemispheres of the brain. And when we move our eyes back and forth, like we do in REM sleep states, that it unravels the triggering effects of the traumatic memory. So the first time I did it was with a therapist a couple weeks after the mudslide. And again, same kind of thing. I was like, how is this going to work? I'm holding, some people tap, some people use buzzers. So the buzzers alternate buzzing right and left in your hands. But the idea is, again, that bilateral right, left stimulation. And you tell the story. And the first time I told the story, I was sobbing. My heart rate was really extremely elevated. I was in that fight or flight response. The second time, it was a little bit less. The third time, and it kind of lessened and lessened and lessened. But same thing. Like, is there really any way this is going to work? And that night was the first night that I didn't have a nightmare. So for me, it was extremely powerful. Again, it's that idea of like these neural pathways. If we think about certain thought patterns, can just like anything that we do over and over again, it's like a groove, and it's kind of breaking the loop. So the groove at like the brain, instead of going like in the same familiar way, is like, oh, now I'm going to go this way, and creating these new neural pathways and disrupting that unhelpful, traumatizing, triggering story.
And was it EMDR that had the impact on neuroplasticity, or was that one of the other modalities that we'll talk about later?
EMDR definitely impacts neuroplasticity because, again, it's this whole idea of forming new neural pathways, which is neuroplasticity.
So reprogramming ourselves.
Yeah.
And the one that you did that had a big impact for you, it sounded like it was one of the more impactful ones. And I have heard it's one of the fastest ways to treat depression and post-traumatic stress disorder a number of times. And that's the idea of ketamine therapy, which seems super interesting because the experience is very short in duration relative to a lot of other hallucinogenic therapies, whether it's ayahuasca, whether it's MDMA. they can be a longer journey. But my understanding with ketamine is super tight journey, very powerful results. Can you take us through your experience with ketamine and what people are understanding about this as a type of therapy for us to heal?
Ketamine it was described to me by Dr. Jeff Becker, who I adore and is a brilliant man, psychiatrist, as the gentlest but most powerful psychedelic. It's also the only psychedelic that is legal in the United States. I'm not sure about Canada, but it is legal in the United States, which is why I also want to have this disclaimer. In the US, there's these like ketamine bars popping up where people can go in and get injected and you're in and you're out. That's not what I'm talking about. And I don't recommend that, because for trauma or depression or using ketamine reverently as a healing tool, I think you really need the before with the psychiatrist, the actual experience of having the journey, and then you need the integration follow up with the psychiatrist. So that's what I'm recommending. And that is what really did change my life. And again, I had done EMDR, I'd done talk therapy, I'd done a lot of things leading up to doing the ketamine. And as I said earlier, I grew up in the 80s in Washington, D.C. with like Nancy Reagan, just say no to drugs, such a goody two shoes, never like was bad at smoking pot, didn't ever really like drugs. Cut to, I'm writing this book, I'm doing all this research, and I met Dr. Becker's wife at a lunch, and we like got into it. And she's like, I think you need to meet my husband. And talking to him and understanding what you are explaining, it is gentle, but it shows you what you need to know. Whereas Dr. Becker was like, unlike mushrooms, which can like force you to your knees and make you see what you need to know, ketamine, it just gently shows it to you. And it is a super short half-life. So, which means it wears off quickly. So in our sessions, we did 3 injections. And again, the psychiatrist works with you on your weight and your body, to figure out how much is the right dose. And each little trip lasts like 20 minutes. So it's kind of, you have a little trip, and then you go again, and then you go again. So 60 minutes of being under the influence, I guess. And it was incredibly powerful for me, who has never done anything like this. But again, this idea of like, I think I've referenced it earlier, but of the knowing that there's so much more going on than we're aware of in our 3-dimensional reality. And also with ketamine, I think it's a pretty common experience, and I had it too, the idea of depersonalizing the trauma. So I witnessed, I had an event of being molested when I was 7 by a 70-year-old man, and that kind of led me to begin my healing journey. But I had never obviously gone into the subconscious like this. So that, even though I was there to deal with the mudside trauma, that was the first trauma that like popped up. And I had a visual of little 7-year-old Mary and this man, but I was kind of watching, and it was safe and whatever. And then out of the blackness, this like gorilla formed. And my first thought is, am I scared of the gorilla? And then I was like, no, the gorilla's the gorilla's safe. The gorilla's good. And the gorilla swooped into this scene and scooped little 7-year-old Mary out of there and away from that man. And, in talking about it, integrating afterwards with Dr. Becker, the gorilla represents the strong, fierce gorilla part of myself that was able to go back and like help 7-year-old Mary heal from that. So it's just like things like that it's, I don't know, deep personalizing in a way. You're like, oh, there was that understanding for me too in the experience. Like what happened to me was not personal. It was a force of nature moving through him. I happened to be in his path.
One of the interesting things about that, one of my favorite quotes on this show, and probably because it's one of my favorite quotes, is until you make your unconscious conscious, you will forever be led by it, and call it fate, by Carl Jung. And I might have butchered it a little there, but it's the idea that we need to know what's under the surface. And it sounds like ketamine gave you that visibility under the surface, and meditation can do that. And this next one we're going to talk about can do that either, because where I want to shift us is ketamine gets us there with chemicals, with a drug. But the next one, you're able to get there without any external drugs, just with our system. And for you, it felt like 6 months of therapy in one session in terms of the magnitude of clearing and healing. And I had a similar reaction when I did it once, where they talk in advance about, hey, when we do this, you may end up crying. And I'm like, oh, what are the odds of that? To bawling like a baby in the fetal position, crying more than I'd ever cried in my life. And that was the holotropic breath work. Can you talk about how does that work scientifically? What is it doing to us? And how does it have such a powerful reaction when we do it?
Well, it was founded by a psychiatrist named Dr. Stanislav Grof, who's like 98 now. And he's a Czech psychiatrist who was working in Czechoslovakia with psychedelic drugs and having great effects with his patients. When he moved to the United States, where they were not legal, he and his wife, Christina, had to find another way to access that subconscious. So they formulated this way of breathing that kind of shuts off oxygen again to that part of the brain that gets in our way a lot, that like doubt, fear part of the brain, kind of quiets that. And the body is flooded with CO2, carbon dioxide, which is why when, in the prep work, they're like, your hands may go like claws and your lips might go like that. And you might feel like you're a tube of toothpaste being squeezed or whatever it is. That's the CO2 flooding the body and the brain. And because we're quieting that other part of the brain that normally is in control, that's where we get this other access to the subconscious, which, honestly, the ketamine and the holotropic breath work, it was like, they were both so extremely powerful. And to your point, like the breath work, you don't have to take anything. Yeah. So that's a great place to maybe start for someone that is like, can't take drugs or doesn't want to take drugs. Like that might be a good place to start.
And for our listeners, so that's a bit more of an extreme form of work you can do with your breath that has a positive impact for healing your trauma. And there's so many others that you can read about, that you can research, that you can understand, where just simply the power of how we breathe can impact. And if we go back to the idea of taking us from the sympathetic to the parasympathetic, simply by practicing box breathing, we can move from one state to the other. Deep breath in, hold for 4 or 5, deep breath out, hold for 4 or 5. And that can take us from one state to the other. So for our listeners, definitely do your research on breath work, on different breath practices you can do to change your states. It's absolutely one of the most fascinating and free ways that we can address our traumas. And for you, Mary, near the end of the book, you talk about all these different healing modalities. And there's even more that we didn't talk about because I don't want to give away every single one that's in your book. So we talked about some of the great ones, and there are many more. Is you also then offer tools and strategies and some simple practices that people can use to keep in touch with the gifts following the trauma. Can you share some of those with people that they should be thinking about and incorporating into their lives?
Yeah, we've kind of touched on some of them. I do have a daily practice that, sometimes feels like a full-time job, but I notice, and on the days that you're like, oh, I feel great, I don't need to do it today. It's like, no, those are exactly the days that you need to do it, because then that makes the other days that are a bit dippy, I find I rebound more quickly. It doesn't last as long. So for me, my daily practice is, we talked about Qigong, but I do Qigong, and I have a morning meeting with myself and with the divine or God or whatever. And for some people, God is very triggering. So like higher power, the universe, whatever you want to call it, where I read just for few minutes, something inspirational. I love Florence Scovel Shinn. She's an amazing spiritual teacher who was writing around the turn of the century. And a lot of people don't know about her. I love her. She's amazing. Or Mark Nepo's books I love to read too, or even, poetry, whatever gets you in that heart open, expansive state of being. So I do a short reading, and then I write a letter to God and myself, and it's all gratitude, and it's what I'm grateful for and what I'm bringing into my life, and writing it in the as if it's already happened. And again, I think a lot of people talk about manifesting is not about for me, not about ooh, I want a Mercedes. And if you do, great. There's nothing wrong with wanting a Mercedes, but it's not just cutting out a picture of a Mercedes and sticking it on your vision board. It's okay, what's the feeling for you that having the Mercedes would give you? Is it you feel the wind through your hair, you feel free, you feel like you can go places, so it's really connecting to the feeling and actively experiencing the feeling. That's what I've noticed. And, kind of even getting underneath. Well, and then you might not even need the Mercedes after all. It's wait, I'm free and I can go places. And
can I interject on that one? Because that's taking it the step further that I often now will do with some young people when they ask questions like this is, well, wait a second. It's not the Mercedes you want. What is it you truly want? Does that Mercedes make you feel like people will think that you're a certain thing? And then the next question, going back to our making the unconscious conscious, why do you want that? When in your life did you not feel like people looked at you the right way or that you were free? And is this car going to fill the void of your dad not saying I love you when you were little? And so do you need the car? Or do you just need to go talk to your dad and have him say, I love you, son? Where are we going for here? So sorry, that was a digression, but I loved where you were going with that one.
Yeah, and I love that. And it's true, right? If we peel back our desires, at the end of the day, most of us just really we want to feel loved. We want to feel safe. I mean, I feel like those are the two main ones.
Yeah, we want to be loved. We want to be safe, and we want to be seen.
Yes. And truly seen, not just seen because we're driving a red Mercedes. So those are my, really the gratitude practice, the Qigong, moving my body. Those are my main, and the meditating. Gosh, see, it's like a full-time job.
And you also journal every day, do you not? Was that part of the letter to God and yourself?
Yeah.
Okay, so do the Qigong, do the journal, do the reading, inspirational reading and faith exercise. And that could be prayer for someone, whatever it is for each person. Then you meditate. And when you said moving the body, is that the Qigong, or is there another movement exercise like a walking or a yoga?
Yeah, that's exercise, getting my heart rate up, whether it's there's an online dance workout that I like, Whitney Hoover, I do her, or I go on a hike or to yoga. But even if it's just for 20 minutes, if it's one of those days where you don't, I'm okay, I know I'm going to feel so much better if I just can sweat it out for 20 minutes.
Oh, I love that. So that will be powerful for people because establishing, and you're right, it's so hard when you compile a list, and I might write about this sometime, is all the things we're supposed to do on a daily basis. And you compile the list and you're like, well, no, those would take me 18 hours a day to do. And then I could sleep for 6. But I also have children and a partner and a job. The job takes 8 hours. So when am I supposed to read, meditate, write, journal, breath work, sauna, yoga? You start going down the list, it becomes overwhelming. So you do have a list that you maintain. It's still not a super short list, but you're able to do it in a way that's manageable. How long would you say in the morning when you do this, your daily practice takes you?
At least, not counting the exercise part, probably at least half an hour.
At least half. Yeah. So that's not too bad.
No. And, sometimes there's days where it doesn't happen the timing that I want it to happen. And I think another thing that's really important, and I'm telling myself this too, is like doing the practices not out of a sense of obligation or like, well, it checks my spiritual practice off the list, but remembering, okay, like maintaining that connection to why I'm doing it. I'm not just doing it to do it, which I need to remind myself of sometimes.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And so we've gone pretty wide on the different modalities and we've gone deep on some of them. Are there any specifics that we haven't covered that you want to make sure the listeners get in those areas?
I mean, I do have a whole part on prayer. I interviewed Reverend Michael Beckwith, who I love. He's so inspiring and he was really helpful. There's so much in there and such a range because everybody has their own particular way in, or maybe they've been on their healing journey for a long time and we're needing some new, psychological astrology. That's kind of fun and interesting too. The more I learn about and have studied with, I love her. She's like a role model mentor, Dr. Jennifer Freed. She has a couple books out. But the more I've studied and learned about astrology, I find that fascinating. There's just so many different tools to understand ourselves and our loved ones and our triggers. So I would say I really try to offer shamanism. Be really careful who you work with because shamanism, different strains of it can come from black magic and voodoo. So I hope that I'm empowering the reader to trust themselves. So if, it's like just because I recommend ketamine or you and I are recommending holotropic breath work, like if it doesn't feel right, like don't do it. Or it might be the wrong practitioner. It might not be the right therapy for you. It might not be the right time to try that therapy. So I would say there's so many more in there.
And you raise a good point for the listeners. Do your research, do your homework. Part of what we're trying to do is just open people's eyes to there's more options and opportunities available that they may not be aware of. So you may have never heard of EMDR. You may have never heard of holotropic breath work. Now you have heard of something. And if you're on a healing journey and you haven't found that something that worked, there may be other opportunities available to you so you don't have to give up. You don't think, well, I just have to live like this for the rest of my life.
No, Clint, there's so many more opportunities and so many different ways in. And yeah, so keep trying. I don't like the word try. Keep at it. Keep investigating. You're speaking to the listeners, like your hope and your light and your healing is like absolutely possible. And, I don't know. I don't want people to feel like they have to do it alone. So that's why I love these conversations, and it can feel so isolating and you're not alone and there's a community here to support you, and keep going.
And we're like, the word try is on my banned word list. And so when I saw that you said in tips and tricks that people should not use the word try either, I thought that was great. Do you have time for a quick final 4 rapid fire questions that we'll throw at you?
Sure, let's do it.
Okay. So for you, what's one book that's had a significant impact and really changed your life?
I referenced her before, but the Florence Scovel Shinn, it's called The Game of Life. Great book. Highly recommend it.
Excellent. And I will check that out. What are you reading right now? If we check out the bookshelf, what's popping off for you?
At the moment, I'm reading, so I did a book reading at Chaucer's bookstore, which is like the best independent bookstore in Santa Barbara. One of the ones that had been there for a long time. And I'm like, perfect. Like the people that work here know their stuff so well. So I'm like, I need a new book. I love this. I love this. I love that. I like that style. So the manager, steered me to Alice Hoffman, who wrote the Practical Magic series, which they're so well written. She's such a good writer. It's like pulls historical fiction. So there's a lot about like the Salem witch trials, but it's all like historical fiction. And I feel like witchiness, good witchiness, I think I've been that a lot of times. That came up in some of my healing work. It's like, oh, here we are again, but I'm not going to get killed for it this time.
Yeah, hopefully things don't go backwards in some of the ways we've seen that happening. What's one thing you've spent less than $1,000 on that you can't live without, that you bought maybe in the last 12 months?
Gosh, that's a really good one. I like white noise. That helps me sleep at night. So like a little white noise machine. That's kind of not a fun answer, but
No, but my wife and son both use it. And so they have I don't know if you've seen it. If you have an iPhone, they have an app called Sleep Fan.
ooh.
And Sleep Fan's a free app, and they both sleep with that beside their head. Like my wife has her phone just playing that Sleep Fan noise all night long. And then my son does it. One of my boys does it for about 8 hours.
Okay.
Throughout the night. So it's called Sleep Fan. Wonderful little app for when you're on the road, when you're in a hotel. She's always got the white noise going. And I hate any noise, so the white noise kills me. I now sleep with earplugs.
Oh no.
So this show's all about growth, which you've probably picked up on. We're actually rebranding in the new year as the Growth Guide. And so that's coming, which I'm excited about. And so habits, mindsets, behavior shifts, is there any you've taken on in the last 12 months that have had a significant impact on your life?
I think just this idea, I mean, I've practiced it with the book and everything, but really continuing to practice on why did this happen for me, not why did this happen to me, but little things even throughout the day, like not just the big capital T traumas and stuff, but like why did this person cross my path and make me feel like this? And something that might look bad or hard, actually, like what's the blessing or the opportunity in that? So that's something that I've been really working on practicing, and I keep getting opportunities to practice it.
Yeah, it's amazing how such a simple reframe is so powerful. And part of it is just speaking to that locus of control and taking yourself away from victim voice to, well, now I'm the driver of the story and it's happening for me and the world's happening for me, so I can be in charge and have control. It's beautiful. And how can our listeners find you, Mary?
I have a website, an author website, which is maryfirestone.co, not com, because somebody else took that one. So you can find me there and on Instagram at trustingthedawn2022. And also my sister and I have an Instagram, which is at Firestone Sisters.
Firestone Sisters. I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining today. It was great to have a conversation with you.
Thank you, Clint.
If you like the podcast, you'll love our new newsletter, The Growth Guide. Every Thursday, straight to your inbox, with the goal to help you be better, achieve more, and become financially free. Check it out at our website, thegrowth.guide. Subscribe and learn more.